Hello, and here at the TUC's After Austerity conference, one question lurks behind every other, and that is the question of inequality. We all suspect that the rich have been getting the gain for the last third of a century or so, but how far should economists care about who gets what? And in any case, what can be done about it in policy terms? Joining me to discuss all of this, we've got Dean Baker, who's an economist, and Nicola Smith from the TUC. Starting with you, Nicola Smith. Do we really know that inequality's got worse? People have always said that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer.
Well, we know that levels of inequality in the UK now are comparable with those that we saw at the time of the Industrial Revolution. So the share of income going to those at the very top is higher than it's really been in most people's living memory. And that's a trend that got worse over the recession, when incomes of the very top 1 or 2% continued to rocket, while the majority of the population, and particularly those at the bottom, saw their real wages, that's the value of their take-home pay after inflation, fall or stagnate. We know that government tax policy isn't making things any better. New figures out recently have shown us that the share of income paid, for example, by those in the bottom quintile, the share of their income in indirect taxation is around 31%. That's up 3 percentage points on the year. That compares to only around 12 or 13% for those in the top quintile in the UK. So not only are those at the bottom getting less, they're also seeing a higher proportion of their income being taken away in indirect taxation. That'll be the VAT rise.
So we might be in something of a new gilded age, Dean, with rich people doing very well and the rest of us not doing so well. You can see why people on lower pay and bishops might care about that, but why should economists care?
Well, not only is that bad for most of the population, but it's also just bad for their overall growth. We've had much less stability in this sort of environment. If you go back to the period after World War II, the 3 decades after World War II, I'm speaking largely the US, but I think it's a similar story in the UK as well. You had 3 decades of very good growth in which the gains from growth were broadly shared. So workers up and down the income ladder shared in that. And that was, in a sense, self-sustaining. So what would happen is workers would get higher wages. They would go out and spend more. That caused firms to see increases in demand. They would then invest more, had higher productivity. And this was this virtuous circle. That broke down with the changes in the 80s, when most workers were no longer, or at least could not count on sharing in the gains of productivity growth. And that really opened up the door for the sort of bubble economy that we've had in the 80s, 90s, and the last decade, which, as we see, has very serious problems in terms of instability. So both in terms of what we might think of the goal as economy, we want to see everyone gain, not just a small group of people. I mean, that's the point of the economy. And secondly, we do care about stability. And, we all know we brought the economy to the brink of collapse back in 2008. I don't think anyone in their right mind can want to see that again.
Could you just recap for us, though, because there used to be this argument, didn't there, in the 80s, the Thatcher Reagan argument, trickle-down economics, give to those that have, and they're the ones who've actually got the luxury of the time to invest. They don't have to spend all their money, and so they might actually invest it productively. How did that work out?
Well, what's amazing is we've had ample opportunity to test this, and it doesn't work. I mean, we saw actually a big fall off, looking again at the US, but a similar story in the UK. We saw a fall off in investment in the 80s. There's no evidence to support this case that somehow if we cut rich people's taxes that they're going to reward us with a lot more investment. The world just doesn't work that way. Firms, their main determinant of investment is the rate of demand growth. If their workers are getting pay increases, they're going out and spending it. They're seeing growth in demand. That's what's going to cause them to invest. We saw a big fall off in investment precisely because that wasn't happening in the 80s.
Okay, so we know that then for 40 years or so, wage growth has been pretty low for the typical American. For Britain, I think it's more like a dozen years. But what, Nicola, do you think any government could actually do? After all, it's easy to say we should all pay ourselves more.
Absolutely, and there's no easy magic solution to this issue, but there's a whole range of policy prescriptions that, taken together, I do believe could have a significant impact. Let's start with pay at the very top. That's a recent debate in the UK about how we can reduce rewards for the very top executives. There's been a lot of focus on the role of shareholders in doing that. We agree that that's an area that could bring some change, but I think we also have to look at how we can include the voices of a wider range of people in executive pay setting and getting workers on remuneration committees and getting enough another voice that brings a dose of reality into the boardroom is one way that we know from other countries you can actually stop this pay escalating away at the top, where rewards are clearly no longer linked to any form of productivity gains, and try and compress pay distributions in a fairer way. Another issue that you could take up is transparency. If companies had to publish more information on the pay ratios between their top execs and those in the middle and those on the lowest incomes, it might give them more of an incentive to compress those distributions more. We also have to look clearly at the role of trade unions. We know from the IMF, who have also published research on the back of the crash, that actually if you have stronger collective bargaining, if you have a stronger role for social partners in wage setting, that is one of the most significant factors in leading to rising real wages and better pay for those at the bottom. The IMF don't just say that that's a beneficial fact for workers, they note that it has benefits for the whole economy because it brings that stability that Dean was talking about, it makes debt bubbles less likely, and it means people can afford to consume, and that our growth is broader based instead of all being dependent upon one small sector of the economy as it was in the years up to the crash.
We don't have anyone here representing the business side of things. If there were, what they'd say is we've been through a big recession, and precisely because the UK has fairly shriveled trade unions these days and fairly light touch regulation, we've lost 6% of national output, but the employment rate's only dropped by 2%. So we've not seen the output cash in as many lost jobs as we might have expected. And I imagine they'd warn that if we went down the sort of route you're suggesting, then we'd end up with higher unemployment before long.
I don't think there's any evidence at all that small re-regulation of the UK economy and a stronger role for unions across some of the lower paid sectors of the economy would lead to job loss. The key determinant of whether you have job loss in the economy is the amount of demand we have in the economy at the moment. We saw in the 10 years in the roll-up to the recession very strong employment growth in the UK, particularly in lower paid sectors. That was with the introduction of the minimum wage, which particularly in its early years was seeing quite significant increases on an annual basis. There was no evidence that it led to job loss.
Dean, you might not be steeped in the UK detail, but the Prime Minister's talking about getting rid of housing benefit for under 25s, about maybe breaking the link with inflation for some unemployed people in the benefit that they get, and also reining in some of the tax credits that top up low wages. And it's that last one I was just going to ask you about, in-work credits from the government. Do you know anything about what they tend to do to inequality and unemployment around the world?
Well, it's ironic, actually. In the U.S., we made a big point of expanding our program, the Earned Income Tax Credit, that was expanded under President Clinton. Actually had some bipartisan support. The program actually originated with the Republican, Richard Nixon, and it actually increases incentive to work. So it's sort of ironic if your prime minister is saying, he wants to give people more incentive to work. Well, that's exactly what that sort of tax credit does. So that's had, for the most part, there's been a lot of analysis. Most people would say it's a pretty positive effect in the United States. So I think as a general rule, obviously you're giving people at the lower end more money, and it does exactly what you want in the sense that you're giving it to them for working. So I would think that's what a conservative in principle would like to see.
Okay, so lots of suggestions there, even if our panel don't much like the answers from David Cameron. So thank you to Dean and to Nicola.